What's good, people? Jem here.
Terence here.
How you doing, everyone? In today's topic, we're going to talk about that time an agile company used command and control and got some successful results. My gosh, that's taboo, isn't it? Command and control. Command and control for us is really not something evil. It means I know the answer, do it. Now, the problem with that is that can become a little bit addictive, can turn into micromanagement, but we're also not going to be immature or simplistic about it. There are, times where if the house is on fire, you might want to tell someone how to put it out. So, in the conversation today, it's a company that you know about, and this particular manager did use a form of command and control to get the results that they want. And maybe, Terence, should we start with the screenshot that you sent me
Yeah.
on what that looks like? And it's pretty entertaining, isn't it, to say the least? There you go. Can you see it?
Yep. Let's come up now. So the
What,
7 points.
Yeah, 7 point. So this came out from Jeff Bezos to the employees at Amazon. And very ballsy, very bold, very command and control, in my view. All teams will henceforth expose their data and functionality through service interfaces. Okay, so we'll talk about what that means in a minute. Teams must communicate with each other through these interfaces. There will be no other form of inter-process communication allowed. It doesn't matter what tech they use, doesn't matter, get it done. All service interfaces, without exception, must be designed from the ground up to be externalized. So that's another point in itself as well. Anyone who doesn't do this will be fired. Nice. Thank you. Have a nice day as well. No passive aggression there at all. Terence, what was Mr. Bezos actually asking? Sorry, volunteering everyone that they need to do to communicate. Communicate with what?
So really what he's getting to is what we call a team API.
API. Yeah, and maybe we won't assume for the benefit of the layman watching our show. What's the best way to explain an API to someone brand new to these conversations, Terence?
So a way I like to explain an API is basically if you want to use, for example, you want to plug a TV in, or you want to plug something that needs electricity. You don't need to know about wires. You don't need to know about the electricity or watts or amps or anything like that. All
No.
you need to know about is this is a plug socket, that's a plug socket. I plug them in and switch it on. So you just need to know how they connect with each other. And that's like a really dumbed down way of explaining what an API is. An API is something that it's almost like a plug socket that you expose to the rest of the world. And you say, if you need the electricity I can provide, this is what you need to conform to. You need to create your own plug socket, plug it in here, and then I'll give you electricity, or I'll give you the service that I provide.
Great example. And so to kind of contextualize it to Mr. Bezos, what we're hearing is that when one team needs something from another team and they have a dependency or an interdependency, they need a way to communicate, right? This is clear. And what he's saying in that message or that email is from now on, when you communicate, you're going to communicate through APIs.
Yeah.
Was this a good thing? Was this a bad thing? It was definitely command and controlling. We'll let you decide as to whether it was good or bad. Um, Terence, what does that lead to for teams in technology, whether using Scrum, Kanban, XP, whatever, right? What does it lead to when we are telling people they need to communicate through APIs? What's that about?
So really what he's talking about is in the agile space, you'll hear a lot about self-managing teams, about operating like a mini startup,
Yeah.
cross-functional teams, all that sort of thing. And what we're really trying to get to in that is a team that can release work end to end with autonomy. So a team that doesn't depend on other teams. That's really what we're trying to get towards. Now, that's a little bit of a fabled unicorn because as you get in companies of that get to a larger size, the number of dependencies between your teams grows, and it gets really difficult to have a team that is autonomous or able to work on its own.
So just to sound that out, right? Obviously, the purest approach to some people is everything is cross-functional and autonomous. But what we're saying is if you've got a company with more than 30 people, the reality is as you begin to scale, you are going to have not just dependencies, but interdependencies, which are different. Like you and I are interdependent on oxygen or a supply chain to get our food, these are certain constraints, right, in a system that you
Yes.
can't necessarily change. So the question is, how do you manage it better? And to make it pointed to this topic, what we're saying is Jeff Bezos is saying you communicate better through APIs
Yes.
and you need to do it.
Yeah. I mean, you'll hear a lot out there. There's a lot, there's been a lot of movement around Agile doesn't scale, descaling Agile, smaller teams.
Yeah.
And that's all well and good. But when you're in a larger organization with lots and lots of teams, you have dependencies. You have teams that can't do everything. You have a dependency on another team that does something that you can't do.
Yeah. So
So
how do we
what do you,
communicate better? How are we going to do it
how
better?
do you descale? How do you make it that you don't have dependencies in other teams? And this is one way. Jeff Bezos has found one way to do it, which is you talk through an API. In other words, if I need something from your team, don't talk to a human. Use an API and self-serve.
And obviously, look, every person in technology knows the immediate drawback to this, right? If I speak a paragraph to one person and it gets to the fourth person, check out Mary Poppendieck's whole kind of study on tacit knowledge.
Mm.
What is said is not always what is understood. So we agree with this. We know this. There's a cost to this. But Terence, something more interesting come up when we spoke about this. What did this instruction force the people to do in the way that they organized? The fact that they had to have APIs being between them.
Yeah, I think it does two things. One, it really firms up that what you provide as a service, and to make it as an API, it really sort of gives a lot of thought and consideration to that. But the second effect it would have is that if you're not allowed to talk to someone to make a little request,
Yeah.
and it'll do two things. If you talk to each other and you need the same thing all the time, well,
Mm.
that makes sense to make it into an API. But if it's a lot of one-off customizable things that doesn't make sense to make it into an API, like it would be really expensive to do that. So why can't we just talk?
Yeah.
It would call into question your team design.
Clever.
Why do
So
you need
yeah,
to talk to them to do all these one-off little customizable little changes? What's going on there?
yeah, I love what you're saying because you're saying if we are going to build a bridge between you and I to communicate through an API, if we're only going to do that once,
Yes.
right, then now we're going to call into question in the way that our teams are designed within our organization. And that's probably a little bit of the genius of what Bezos did there, right?
Yes.
Improving
That's
the design.
That's a great point. If I need to do this thing once, would I build a bridge around it? No.
Would you
And
bother?
that's it sort of calls into question that if you're forced to do an API and you've got to do these one-off customizable things all the time, is your org design right?
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe we need to consume a certain specialist from another team to live in another cross-functional team. Or you could argue it the other way. Maybe someone is doing something so specialized that it does warrant building a bridge, and all we can then do is manage communication, and the best means or a useful means to use that is through an API.
Yes.
So good or bad thing, Terence? What did this lead to? Because this was about publicizing what they were building, right? In other words, anyone
Yeah.
could use it.
And that externalizable part adds an
Mm.
extra element of cost on that, right? Because it's one thing to have an API internal to your company. It's another thing that has to be externalizable. That's got a whole different level of documentation, of security, of rigor that's required. And
Interesting.
so, how did the development teams respond to that? I actually remember being a developer during the time that this mandate went out. And I remember
Wow.
one of the developers wrote an open letter to the development community saying this is not going to work. It's command and control. It's impossible. The ask is
Wow.
it was a really long-winded letter, and people were leaving Amazon in droves as well. I do remember it was quite controversial at the time.
So people are actually leaving. He faced a lot of resistance. But what did this create? What product did it create? I'm sure the viewers know by now, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it led to the birth of AWS, Amazon Web Services, which is the Amazon cloud platform.
Wow.
So, in other words, back then, if you needed to a server, you'd talk to a team and say, "I need this much bandwidth, this much memory, I need this many servers." They did that via an API, right? They API'd that to say, if you need to request hardware, you now do it via this automated channel and that externalizable, I think it was point number 6 or point number 5, wasn't it? That
Yeah.
externalizable requirement meant that they were able to sell it to the public.
Yes.
And now AWS accounts for about 3/4 of their profit. That's what's ended up happening.
$88 billion in 2023 net sales. So when we're saying command and control, was it successful? Well, that's not a bad amount of money to make, but can we counter that as we come towards the end of the 10 minutes? When we talk about agile, it's about being adaptive, right? It's about using the autonomy of the people, and it's about winning in the market, right? That's really what it is, the bottom line. What was the attrition levels like? In other words, look, people vote with their feet, right? People vote with their feet. You treat them like trash. Well, according to what we're reading here, we're seeing that up to 81% of attrition in the engagement levels. That was the cost of attrition from a leaked document. And that was equated to a loss of $8 billion annually. So it wasn't all, roses, was it?
Wasn't all roses. And what I think is really interesting here is like this comes at a ginormous cost, right? Communicating through APIs, and not only that, externalizable APIs. That's like building a bridge every time you want to talk to someone, as opposed to just rowing a boat over, or whatever
Yes.
analogy you want to use. It's a really expensive way of doing things. But what I thought was interesting is they thought that cost was worth the gain that you get in team autonomy, and in teams not being having dependencies on each other.
And I mean, he took that risk, and you could say financially it paid off. AWS is an absolute monster. And as we start to close, right, you can decide to be the judge as to whether this was successful. But this is a good example of when we talk about agile and concepts of giving people autonomy and so on. Self-organization doesn't mean do what you want. That's called a party. And ultimately, if the CEO is talking about self-organization, the people need to be competent. The direction needs to be clear, and so do the constraints. And those constraints were set out quite clearly. And maybe he was squeezing the people on the level of autonomy that they had, but it looks like a bet that kind of paid off. So, if you would like to know about how to build autonomous teams and create some level of predictability, we have another course running, a small workshop on June the 1st, and it is around flow metrics. So if you want to learn about how to create a level of predictability, please reach out on the YouTube comments. You can find Terence Orai, Terence Joe, Gem Jelly on LinkedIn, and look, we'd love to help.
Sounds
Cheers.
good. Cheers.
Thanks, Terence.